Our first speaker is Frédéric Bauden. He's professor of Arabic language and Islamic studies at the University of Liège, and his research focuses on Mamluk historiography, diplomatics, and codicology. He's the editor of the Biblioteca Macriziana in Leiden, whose main aim is to publish definitive critical editions of al-Maqrīzī's minor and major works, accompanied by annotated translations and thorough introductions. This will be a huge service to the field. And in the whole will be prepared by the specialists of the fields dealt with in each of the works. He's currently completing his monograph for this series entitled Al-Maqrīzī's Collection of Opuscules and Introduction. He's published a number of articles, some recent ones, one in press, Macriziana 14, al-Maqrīzī's last opus, al-Habr al-Bashar, and its significance for the history of Islam in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society, paper documents from Istabul Antar, assessment of the findings and data analysis, in a book about the excavations that is in press as well. Another book about paper formats of the Mamluk period, the contribution of Mamluk chancery paper in the Journal of Islamic Manuscripts, and pilgrimage certificates from the Mamluk period, new data. I should say, these are all things that, according to your faculty website anyway, are in press. So this shows you the kind of productivity we have from this scholar. There are 4 articles in press coming out about Maqrīzī and Mamluk paper. Today, Professor Bauden will be talking to us about al-Maqrīzī, unsurprisingly, and his title is Can al-Maqrīzī be considered an antiquarian? Please join me in welcoming Professor Bauden.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation and also for putting up this very interesting workshop. In the frame of a conference devoted to antiquarianism, a term broadly implying a fascination with the materiality of the past, is it legitimate to read a paper dealing with the Egyptian historian al-Maqrīzī? Al-Maqrīzī was born in Cairo in 1364 and died in his hometown in 1442 at the age of 78. Nowadays, he is mainly known thanks to a book that he dedicated to a historical and geographical description of his homeland, together with a historical and topographical description of the capital, Cairo, entitled The Book of Exhortations and Lessons in Dealing with the Topography and Historical Remains. Until now, it is considered the most detailed description we have of the evolution of the urban plan of Cairo from the Muslim conquest up to al-Maqrīzī's time. But it is also valuable for the particulars it provides on remains from the pharaonic times and or the ethnographic data it preserves on the rights of the religious communities in Egypt. To this book, he later added several others: a history of humankind, a biography of the Prophet, a history of Egypt under Muslim rule, a biographical dictionary of Egyptians, a biographical dictionary of his contemporaries. In so doing, he created a full frame of the history of Egypt that he was able to place in the broader frame of the history of the world and of the Arabs. Besides these huge works totaling thousands of pages, al-Maqrīzī also authored some small treatises where he tackled, among other things, monetary issues. In the light of what precedes, and coming back to my initial question, it clearly appears that al-Maqrīzī definitely deserves to be investigated in order to see if he can be characterized as an antiquarian. And since yesterday morning, we've been debating whether or not the concept of antiquarianism can be identified in or applied to the Islamic world. If we adopt a broader approach, that is, that by antiquarian we mean a person, a poet, scholar, a historian, showing interest in the traces of the past, pre-Islamic or not, then the answer to the question with regard to al-Maqrīzī is yes, and I can stop here my talk, and thank you for your attention. And I must also add that this has been done by several other scholars who considered al-Maqrīzī's work as a lieu de mémoire. But what I wanted to do here is to propose to analyze his engagement with materiality, more precisely monuments, inscriptions, manuscripts, coins, and documents, in order to gain some insight into if and how he worked with this materiality, and if beside book learning he had recourse to some field work, broadly to be understood as visits in his case, for the acquisition of information and the establishment of knowledge. Trying to address these issues directly from al-Maqrīzī's work, it is hoped that we will gain a better image of what kind of antiquarian he was, without imposing a grid where we would like to make him fit. To refine my analysis, it is also essential to compare him with some of his predecessors and contemporaries. But before proceeding with this assessment, I would like to make two comments. First, al-Maqrīzī was no traveler. As Abu Mansur al-Sa'alibi already stated in the 11th century, I quote, "The Egyptians usually never leave their country, even in search for knowledge," unquote. Even at the distance of several centuries, this judgment perfectly describes al-Maqrīzī. With the exception of his travels to Damascus and Mecca, we can fairly state that he seldom left his hometown. His education was almost exclusively carried out in Cairo and to a certain extent in Mecca, but he never went beyond the territories that were under Mamluk control. For a historian of Egypt, this is not unacceptable. But even in Egypt, we will see that he rarely got out of the capital, which is more problematic, perhaps. Second, and this is more caveat than a comment, whenever we read the Khitat, we must be aware that there is a polyphony in the text. There is the voice of the author, al-Maqrīzī, but also the voices of his sources, that is, the other authors. And it is not always easy to distinguish between al-Maqrīzī's voice and those of the others, because it does not necessarily indicate his source, contrary to what he says. In this context, I must also draw attention to the issue of the editions that are available. For a long time, the Bulaq edition, published in 1853, remained the only available standard edition of the whole work. The first critical edition of the full text was carried out by Ayman Fuad Sayyid between 2002 and 2004, with a revised version published by the same scholar in 2013, after the identification of a holograph fair copy of the third volume in Ann Arbor in 2010. The problem with this edition lies in the fact that Sayyid mixed, in fact, two versions of the text. Whenever he found more details in the two holograph volumes of the first version, he decided to privilege the fuller version over the final one that was composed by al-Maqrīzī later on. This means that when we read the Khitat in Sayyid's edition, we gain access to a text that never existed. This means that also, as I've been able to demonstrate, the first version contains in fact a section that sustains an accusation made by one of al-Maqrīzī's contemporaries regarding his acquisition of a work dealing with the same subject composed by one of his neighbors and friends, al-Awhadi. Al-Awhadi died in 1408, after he had been working on the subject for many years. Recently, I've reached the conclusion that several parts of the first version, found in the two manuscripts on the left, on the right, that several sections in this first version are nothing more than the fair copy al-Maqrīzī made of al-Awhadi's draft. Al-Awhadi's personal testimonies that were left untouched in this process were later cancelled by al-Maqrīzī once he produced his own work. Of course, this raises the issue of authorship, which relatively concerns us here. As the following example shows, the difference can, however, be misleading. In Sayyid's edition, the personal and more detailed testimony replaced, as you can see, the less descriptive one. The writer says, "I saw a plaque above the mihrab of the said mosque with the name of Al-Amir, and its construction date is mentioned by Ibn Abd al-Zahir." We have here a very interesting engagement with materiality, with an inscription, and confirming that this inscription is what was read in another source. But the version that you find in the Bulaq edition is impersonal. The names of Al-Ma'mun and Al-Amir are still found on a plaque above the mihrab. No mention of the interaction with the inscription and of the fact that this is mentioned already by another author. It explains why, in what follows, I rely on the Bulaq edition, which truly reflects al-Maqrīzī's final version of the text. In his introduction to the book, al-Maqrīzī details how he decided to organize it in 7 sections, starting with a presentation of the geography of Egypt and proceeding with a description of the cities and its various people. The next sections are exclusively devoted to the chronological description of the topography of Cairo, which ends with the visual representation of power that overlooks the city, the citadel, and the various rulers who occupied it. According to his original plan, the last section had to be devoted to the causes of Egypt's desolation, the main reason that lay behind al-Maqrīzī's intent in writing this book. Without explanation, this section was later abandoned and replaced by the description of religious monuments belonging to the three main religions that prevailed in Egypt at that time: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. All in all, the urban history of Cairo is overwhelming, as it corresponds to 60% of the total text, which is composed, as you can see, of more than 1,000 pages in the Bullock edition, representing some 700,000 words. In his description of Egypt, al-Maqrīzī frequently evokes the monuments of the pharaonic period. As already stressed, al-Maqrīzī rarely left Cairo, and he never visited Upper Egypt, for instance. It means that for his description, he had to rely mostly on earlier sources. In some rare cases, he was able to collect testimonies from contemporary informants, usually telling him stories about strange discoveries. For instance, a cave full of mummified fish, each with a gold coin in its mouth, or an ear of grain discovered inside the brick wall of the pharaonic period that was not spoiled and could be eaten. Well, of course, Maqrīzī was particularly fond of such marvelous stories. Even in the vicinity of Cairo, for instance, the Giza Plateau, al-Maqrīzī does not give many contemporary details. Most of the data stem from older sources, and nothing gives the impression that he even visited the place. No new element is provided with regards to the pyramids, for instance. The only contemporary event that he reports in connection with Giza is the damage that was caused to the Sphinx head by a fanatical Sufi in 1378, and you have here the text. Fanatical is not in the text, of course. This is my interpolation, and this is, of course, well before ISIS. This is an interesting medieval case. But you can see also that al-Maqrīzī is making no comment, positive or negative, regarding this act. But writing about this story several decades later, Maqrīzī was 14 years old when this took place, and Maqrīzī just says that it has remained so to this day. So is he just saying that the Sphinx was in that situation, or did he provide anything regarding its actual state? Nothing, in fact. He provides no description of the Sphinx as it stood then. And I also put there two images coming from a book published in 1755, but the drawings were made in 1737, showing that the nose of the Sphinx was already missing before the French expedition, because sometimes it is believed that, wrongly believed, that it's the Napoleonic expedition who damaged the nose of the Sphinx. In fact, this nose that is missing now is now connected with the story that al-Maqrīzī tells us in the Khitat. But what is more interesting, perhaps, in this note is the fact that he pays attention to the legend that came to be linked to this act, that from that time on, the Seine encroached on much of the plateau. And so we have here a link with the apotropaic value that was given to the Sphinx by the locals, who considered that, given that this took place, it had some bad consequences for them. Even when he describes Alexandria and its wonders, speaking of the pharaohs, he confines himself to the past. What was left of the pharaohs in his own time, one could ask? According to al-Maqrīzī, the lighthouse was destroyed in 1303 due to an earthquake, then partially rebuilt in the course of the next year, and he says it has survived to my own time. Is this his voice or the voice of his source? Probably the latter, because it is known that what remained of the lighthouse was completely destroyed by the 1326 earthquake. Even when discoveries of the past are made in Cairo, al-Maqrīzī does not seem interested in checking by himself the sometimes far-fetched reports that reached him. In the 1380s, for instance, a group of stone cutters who were carrying stones in a cave to the north of the citadel discovered a black stone with an inscription which nobody could read. They cut away the ground in front of it, reached a huge pillar that they smashed to pieces. It was hollow, and its whole height was filled with a man standing on his feet. From the top of it, a lot of dinars, gold coins, came raining down on them. The case was brought to the Sultan. And Maqrīzī adds, I quote, "When word got around about the incident, people went to the cave and amused themselves with the cadaver inside. Someone who saw a tooth of that dead told me that it was black and the size of an eggplant, and that his shin bone from foot to knee measured 5 cubits, which would make his height 20 cubits or more. The pulp of a single one of his teeth was the size of an eggplant and resembled nothing more than a big bubble, unquote. Al-Maqrīzī gives full credence to this story as it is located in the middle of several anecdotes linked to the discovery of huge bones attesting to the size of humans in ancient times, and it has been dealt with yesterday, stating, I myself had an experience of that sort in my lifetime, and this is the story he's telling us. But even though it reached him when he was an adult and in the vicinity of power at that time, at no time did he feel the need to check the veracity of the story, or even to see these tubes that had the size of an eggplant. Al-Maqrīzī's engagement with the remains of the pre-Islamic period is disappointing. Due to his almost exclusive reliance on earlier sources, to which he sometimes adds some contemporary testimonies, his knowledge of the monuments of antiquity is almost entirely due to book learning. In the absence of original investigation or visits on the spot, his knowledge is mainly second-hand. As a consequence, his treatment of the material can only be superficial and largely limited to legendary stories. But let us now turn to the Islamic past in order to see if his treatment of the material differs from those of the pre-Islamic period. Outside Cairo, there is one city that he seems to have visited at large, Damietta. Told by one of his acquaintances that it was the most beautiful town he had never seen, Al-Maqrīzī first thought that he was exaggerating. I quote, until I saw it with my own eyes, and it turned out to be indeed the most beautiful and most enjoyable place, unquote. The city to which charms Al-Maqrīzī succumbed was in fact a recent one. After its seizure by the Crusaders of St. Louis in 1249, the city was razed by the newly established Mamluk Sultan 1 year later for fear that it could be reconquered by the Franks in the future. The only building that was left untouched was the Old Mosque, built by the conqueror of Egypt, Amr ibn al-As. A new city emerged to the south of the ruins, which Al-Maqrīzī visited, but he also went to see the Old Mosque. He stresses that he saw a Kufic inscription above its entrance, which said that it was restored after 500 Hijra. The mosque survived until our own time, though it was in bad conditions already at the end of the 19th century, and you can see that the situation didn't improve about 30 years ago when I saw it. And it has been recently not restored, but rebuilt. That means that the old building, what was left there, on the pictures you could see, was completely removed, and no excavation of any kind was done on this mosque, which is considered as the second oldest mosque in Egypt, by Amr ibn al-As. And they only left the one original piece, which is the minaret, what was left of the minaret. The inscription that Al-Maqrīzī saw above the entrance has fortunately been preserved and is now found at the Islamic Museum in Cairo. Its text was published more than 100 years ago. It confirms that the text is in Kufic style, a type of script that Al-Maqrīzī correctly identified, and that the mosque was restored after the year 500. More precisely, the date given in the inscription is 521, so 1127. Al-Maqrīzī thus saw the inscription, but could he decipher it? Apparently, he was able to read the end of the date, but not the full date, and he did not mention the name of the Fatimid Caliph who ordered the restoration. Clearly, it is when he deals with the urban history of Cairo that Al-Maqrīzī made every effort to go all over town. As he expresses it at the beginning of this part of the work, I quote, "This is the description of Cairo today. You will thus know, if God will, how we founded these localities and what they have become, and the various designations according to the person to whom they are related, or by which they are known, and that from what I have gathered in the historical books and compilations of eminent authors, and from what I have learned from the writings of reliable witnesses, which was told to me by the sheikhs, my contemporaries, or which I observed myself in my comings and goings," unquote. This part of the Khitat is indeed full of passages where he states, "I saw." Usually, he does so to stress the state in which the monument or the area he visited was either in ruin or still standing. The typical entry begins with the current or past location of the monument, then proceeds with mention of the monument in the various sources where al-Maqrīzī spotted data related to it, the whole presented in chronological order. Then he provides some biographical information on its founder, if known, and some details on its present state. For his descriptions, he thus mainly relied on his sources once again. Even if he visited most of the buildings he described, he left little information about his experience with the monument. Let us consider as a speaking example the Nilometer. This monument, located on the island of Rauda, facing the old part of Cairo, was the most crucial for the city, as it helped the government to measure the height reached by the Nile. Once it had reached the limit of 16 cubits, the canal was opened, allowing the flooding of the delta and the beginning of cultivation. The monument has been preserved and it attests to the importance the various dynasties who ruled Egypt gave to it. Its oldest parts date back to the early Abbasid period, as witnessed by the inscriptions. Al-Maqrīzī's description is detailed, thanks to the sources he resorted to. But when he gives its description, he quotes a traveler, Ibn Jubayr, who visited the Nilometer in the late 12th century. When I say he quotes, I should add that al-Maqrīzī does not credit Ibn Jubayr for this passage. Besides this short description, al-Maqrīzī adds nothing of his own. No reference to the inscriptions, no mention of his experience with the monument. So we can ask, did he visit the monument? It is difficult to answer the question, of course, considering that there is an entry in the Khitat for the adjacent mosque erected in the Fatimid period at the end of the 11th century, but that this entry was left empty in the text. We may question if he made the trip to Ar-Rawda Island. When it comes to monuments that are closer to the place where we lived, in the center of the Fatimid city, we could expect that he engaged more with the monuments. One of these was the Al-Azhar Mosque, built in the Fatimid period. The entry opens with the date of its foundation, which was found on an inscription. This inscription is now lost, and it is known thanks to the transcription al-Maqrīzī gave of it in his Khitat. The text found in the Bulak edition is devoid of any mention of personal visual observation, as you can see. I quote, "Inside the dome of the first colonnade, which is to the right of the mihrab and the minbar, what follows is inscribed after the basmala," and you have the text of the inscription. However, in the first version, now included in the Khitat by Sayyid, the text gives a rather different impression. The author says, "I saw an inscription," and then you have the text. The cancellation of this version, which would make of al-Maqrīzī the eyewitness of this inscription, is striking. What led him to cancel it in the final version of his text? We would at least have one example of the way he engaged with inscriptions. Moreover, a rare one that has since disappeared, and it is not mentioned by anyone else. The only valid reason is that he refrained from quoting these words because they were not his. Rather those of al-Awhadi, the author of the book on the Khitat, which al-Maqrīzī appropriated at his death. I already drew the attention to this issue at the beginning of my paper with an inscription found in Al-Aqmar Mosque, where al-Maqrīzī cancelled the personal testimony in the final version of his text. This entry also allows us to proceed further with the analysis because it contains indications of a restoration that was not mentioned in the first version of the Khitat, and consequently in al-Awhadi's text. Al-Maqrīzī talks about the restoration of this mosque in his own time and adds that the emir who paid for the works, I quote, put above the mihrab plaque with an inscription mentioning that what was in it initially and his restoration of this mosque. He indicated his epithets and titles in it. The preserved inscription confirms al-Maqrīzī's words, but he failed to give its full text, like his predecessors in the field would have done, like al-Awhadi, for instance. A late example will suffice to strengthen this impression. This time it deals with a manuscript of the Quran that was kept in the Old Mosque of Fustat, which foundation goes back to the Muslim conquest. The Amr ibn al-As Mosque is indeed famous nowadays for a large amount of Qurans on parchment that it once held. These manuscripts are now dispersed among various libraries around the world, the most significant parts being scattered between Paris and St. Petersburg. The reason for this distribution must be sought in the circumstances in which they were taken out from their repository. Most of the collection was plundered in the aftermath of the French expedition, which took place at the very end of the 18th century. One of these was reported to be the personal copy of the third caliph, who is credited with the establishment of the Vulgate. Al-Maqrīzī provides reports about this manuscript, mostly based on older sources, then concludes his narrative by saying, "I saw this Quran." And then he adds, here is the copy of what is found at its end. And then you have the text of the inscription, but then at some point he adds, what follows these words has been obliterated from the back of the Quran. What was effaced looked like being. So we have here somebody trying to decipher something that has been erased. By copying the text that was found on the back of the last leaf, al-Maqrīzī showed his interest in his object, of course. Unfortunately, all these words are not his, once more. He copied them without acknowledging from the work of his colleague Ibn Duqmaq, who died in 406. The full quotation can be found word for word in the parts that survive of his book on the topography of Cairo. This is an additional example that shows that how al-Maqrīzī mainly relies on other authorities when it comes to the materiality of objects. Beside the Khitat, there is another work that deserves to be investigated for the way he might have engaged with objects. It is his work entitled Shudhur al-Nuqud, which was mentioned yesterday by Stefan. Considered for a long time to be merely a treatise on numismatics by reason of the historical survey it provides of coinage in Islam, Shudhur al-Uqud is nowadays rather contemplated as an indictment of the monetary policy of the Circassians, as Adel al-Louj characterized it. The treatise aims at providing the Sultan with recommendations for reforms judged indispensable by al-Maqrīzī in terms of monetary policy, by taking as a model the examples of the rulers of the past. The text was structured in 4 sections. The first section on ancient money is concerned with the coins that circulated before the appearance of Islam. It is connected with the next one on Islamic money through an evocation of the Prophet's decisions regarding the validity of the system that prevailed in his time. In this section, the Maqrīzī details the evolutions and reforms money experienced during the first 2 centuries that followed, concluding it with a remark linked to the beginning of the alteration of the dirham. This brings him to the 3rd section on the money of Egypt, where he tells the story of money in his own country from the conquest up to his own time. He then introduces a transition which is essential as it connects the preceding parts, purely historical, with the forthcoming section where his recommendations are detailed. The transition's aim is to demonstrate the merits of the reform introduced by the ruling sultan at that time, al-Mu'ayyad Sheikh, who created a new dirham, the dirham Mu'ayyadi, comparing this new coin with the monetary reform of the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik. And Maqrīzī nevertheless stresses that this reform will have little effect on the economy as long as the money of account will remain the dirham min al-fulus, or copper money. The transition concludes with the recommendations for the action that should be taken in order to change the order of things. It is in the 2nd section on Islamic money that Maqrīzī traces a panorama of the various coins that were struck by the caliphs, sometimes mentioning the legends or details that featured on the coins. Like in this case, where he elaborates on the coins struck by the vizier's sons al-Abbas ibn al-Fadl, and this is precisely the case mentioned yesterday by Stefan. You have here the quotation. The coins that have reached us confirms al-Maqrīzī's testimony with a slight difference regarding the name of al-Abbas. The name of his father al-Fadl does not feature on them. Coins of the early centuries regularly resurfaced on the occasion of the discovery of a hoard, just like nowadays. But did al-Maqrīzī personally see the coins for which he mentions such details in his treatise? Once again, we face the issue of the voice of the author or of his potential source. In this case, we would probably have to conclude that he behaved like an antiquarian if it were not for one small detail. In fact, he relied on a source that is now lost, but which still circulated in his lifetime in a summarized version. Al-Maqrīzī's notebook preserved in Liège is helpful in this respect, as it contains the resume Al-Maqrīzī made of Kitab al-Dananir wa Darahim, the book of dinars and dirhams, by Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Khalaf ibn Hayyan, better known as Waqī'a, an author who died in the early 10th century. A comparison of this resume with the text present in the relevant section of Al-Maqrīzī's Shudhur al-Uqud demonstrates that he exploited nearly 3/4 of it. Consequently, all the details regarding these coins, including the legends that he quotes, are to be attributed to Waqī'a, not to al-Maqrīzī. There is yet another possibility to assess the way al-Maqrīzī engaged with traces of the past, in this case of the more recent past. Some of his holograph manuscripts, above all notebooks and drafts, are particularly noticeable for the writing material he used, chancery documents from the Mamluk period. The main feature of most of the documents issued by the Cairoan chancery lie in their shape. a roll of several sheets of paper pasted one below the other. Its width depended on the nature of the document and the rank of the addressee. As for its length, it was determined by the text itself and some additional physical conditions linked once again to the nature of the document and the rank of the addressee, with in some cases a large interlinear space. In these circumstances, it is not rare to get a roll reaching 20 meters or even more. Moreover, the text was exclusively written on one side of the roll. Thanks to, or because of, depending on the point of view, these features, these documents were ideal for reuse. Cut out into pieces, the documents could be transformed into quires, and this is what happened. Scrap paper. In al-Maqrīzī's holographs, some 600 leaves correspond to reused documents, which represent about 12% of the total of the leaves, found in his holographed manuscripts. Some of the leaves contain critical pieces of information that are helpful to identify, date, and contextualize the original document. One of these regards a deed for the granting of land tenure to a Bedouin from Karak, now in Jordan, Baligh ibn Yusuf ibn Tayyi, whose name appears on one leaf, as you can see here. This person was responsible for the fate of a sultan who locked himself up in the fortress of Karak between 1342 and 1344. Baligh was one of his most trusted supporters in Karak, and it is due to his betrayal that the fortress could be taken after more than 2 years of resistance and the intractable sultan killed. In exchange for his betrayal, Baligh received a land tenure granted to him by the sultan ruling in Cairo. The document preserved in Maqrīzī's holographs correspond to the deed granting Baligh this land tenure. Was al-Maqrīzī interested in this case? He was indeed, as he reported these events with great details in his Chronicle of the Mamluk Sultans. He is even the historian who presents the most comprehensive account of these events. In such a circumstance, he could not ignore that he was writing down his personal notes on the original deed once delivered to Baligh. Due to his experience at the chancery in his early career, he could not even ignore the nature of the document. Nevertheless, he fails to acknowledge that he saw the original document, or even to record parts of its contents. This attitude is even confirmed for his own lifetime, as the reused documents once again confirm. Though he had access to contemporary documents of a diplomatic nature, by definition of the utmost importance for a chronicler, he neglected to record or just mention parts of the diplomatic letters that reach Cairo from Tabriz, is in this case, for instance, or from Taiz in Yemen. At the end of this paper, it is once more legitimate to ask the question, can al-Maqrīzī be considered an antiquarian? We have seen that al-Maqrīzī engaged in a very limited way with objects of the past, be they monuments, inscriptions, documents, or manuscripts. The reading of his texts, which are replete with details about such objects, leaves the impression that he was eager for knowledge of their past. The scrutiny of the polyphony of his texts rather shows that he rarely is the source of such descriptions, and that he is totally dependent on the work of his predecessors, those of the past or even his contemporaries. These contemporaries, like Ibn Duqbaq and al-Awhadi, worked on the same subject, but they didn't refrain from quoting and describing the traces of the past that they saw, feeling the need to transmit information that would otherwise have been lost. Other contemporaries of al-Maqrīzī, historians like Ibn al-Furat and al-Fasi, the historian of Mecca, are nowadays celebrated by modern historians for the attention they pay to documents, tombstones, and monuments they quoted in their works to support what they advanced. All in all, al-Maqrīzī poorly engaged with these traces in the way his predecessors and contemporaries did. Does this mean that the answer to the question is negative? Well, at this stage, you understand that not. Probably not. And it is Alain Schnapp who offers her a way out. In his introduction to World Antiquarianism, Comparative Perspectives, he stressed that, I quote, words cannot resist the destructive power of time and the passage of successive generations any more than things. But the memories salvaged by those who collect different versions guarantee the immaterial continuity of what is past. Words and things are united against time through the practice of collecting, and that activity has become a key to all our knowledge of the past. Fragments, words, monuments, everything perishes. But all that is needed is an intuition for the most fragile object to survive in the memory of those whom we may identify in the old Roman term as antiquarians, unquote. In composing his book, al-Maqrīzī compiled a huge amount of data he collected in sources that have sometimes been lost. The result is the most detailed urban history of Cairo that has survived. Al-Maqrīzī had the intuition to preserve for the future the memory of that city, and it is probably for that that he deserves to be considered an antiquarian. Thank you.